My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 31 years old, and for 4 days last October, I was the only person sitting in a hospital waiting room while my 84-year-old grandmother underwent open-heart surgery, because the rest of my family had already paid $4,200 in non-refundable travel for my cousin's destination wedding and decided, as my mother put it, that Grandma would want us to go. What none of them knew was that this wasn't the first time it had happened. And what none of them knew, either, was that my grandmother's attorney had already been sitting in a waiting room chair beside me for 2 hours before any of them landed back in Ohio, holding a manila folder none of us had been told existed. Her silent revenge stories. If you've ever been the only name on the emergency contact list who actually answered the phone, comment "I've been there" below. This one's for you. I've worked as a children's librarian at the Maple Heights branch for 6 years. It's a job most people don't think about until they need it. Story time on Tuesday mornings, summer reading logs, helping a 9-year-old find a book that won't scare him but also won't bore him. I mention this because it matters later. I am, by profession and by temperament, someone who is used to being patient with people who aren't ready to hear something yet, and used to being the last one anyone thinks to check on. My coworkers describe me as steady. My family describes me, when they describe me at all, as the responsible one, which I used to hear as a compliment before I understood it was closer to a job title nobody had actually offered me the chance to decline. I want to describe an ordinary Wednesday before I tell you about the extraordinary ones, because I think it matters for understanding how invisible this all was, even to me, for so long. I'd finish my shift at 5, drive the 15 minutes to Chestnut Avenue, and let myself in with the key Vivian had given me years ago. She'd usually already have the kettle on, having heard my car in the driveway. We'd sit at her kitchen table, the same one that would later hold a very different kind of meeting, and she'd ask about the kids at the library, the ones who came in every week, as if she knew them personally by now. I never thought of these visits as an obligation. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as a martyrdom, and it wasn't one, not for years. It was simply the best part of most of my weeks. My grandmother, Vivian Ashcroft, is 84 years old, sharp enough to still beat me at gin rummy, and widowed since I was in middle school. My grandfather, Walter, died when I was 12, and in the 22 years since, Vivian has lived alone in the same modest brick house on Chestnut Avenue, 3 miles from the library where I work. I've always been close to her in a way that's a little different from the rest of my family. I stopped by on Wednesdays after my shift, just to sit with her and drink tea and hear stories about my grandfather that got a little more polished each time she told them. I didn't think of myself as her caregiver, exactly. I thought of myself as someone who liked her company. Looking back, I think those two things had already started blurring together long before I noticed. I should say a little about my grandfather, Walter, because Vivian rarely talked about him without a specific kind of light coming into her face. He ran a small hardware store on Main Street for 30 years, the kind of place where he knew every customer's name and exactly what project they were working on. He died of a stroke at 69, fast and without much warning, and I think something in Vivian's relationship to the rest of the family shifted after that, in ways nobody named at the time. My mother and aunt were both already married with their own households by then, and I think grief, for them, looked like keeping busy, hosting, planning, filling calendars, while for Vivian, it looked like slowing down and noticing, more carefully than before, who actually sat with her in the quiet. My mother, Denise Bennett, is Vivian's older daughter, practical, a little brisk, the kind of person who shows love through logistics rather than sentiment. My aunt Pam Reyes is 5 years younger, warmer on the surface, married to my uncle Frank, and the mother of my cousin Brooke. I want to be fair to both of them, because I've spent a long time being angry at them and I don't think anger is the whole truth. My mother genuinely believes she's a good daughter. She calls Vivian every Sunday, without fail, and has for years. My aunt genuinely believes family togetherness matters more than almost anything else. Neither of them, I don't think, ever consciously decided that togetherness meant showing up everywhere except the places that were inconvenient. It just quietly worked out that way, over and over, until it became a pattern nobody in the family had a name for except me. Something my mother told me once, years ago, has stayed with me through all of this. She said that when she and Pam were growing up, their own mother, my great-grandmother, had been sick for most of their adolescence, and the household had revolved entirely around managing her illness, doctor's appointments, hospital stays that 8 whole summers. My mother said she'd promised herself, as a teenager, that she'd never let her own life get swallowed by someone else's medical crisis the way her childhood had been. I didn't understand, when she told me that story, that I was hearing the origin of a pattern I would eventually find myself standing directly inside of. My mother wasn't choosing the wedding over Vivian out of indifference. I think, in some deep and mostly unconscious way, she was protecting a version of herself that had once been swallowed whole and had promised never to let it happen again, even if protecting that old wound meant, this time, someone else had to be the one standing in the room. My cousin Brooke, Pam and Frank's only daughter, got engaged the year before to a man named Tyler, and they planned a destination wedding on the Outer Banks, 4 days, a rented beach house for 12 people, flights booked 8 months in advance. Everyone in the family was going, my mother, my aunt and uncle, my 2 younger cousins, even my mother's cousin Diane from Michigan. Everyone except me, because I'd committed to covering a coworker's maternity leave that same week, and Vivian, because at 84, 4 days at a beach house wasn't really her idea of a good time anymore. I didn't think anything of it. It felt, at the time, like an ordinary scheduling gap, nothing more. I need to back up, though, to something that happened 6 months before the wedding, because it matters more than anyone in my family understood at the time. On a Saturday night in April, during a Ohio State-Michigan watch party my mother and aunt were hosting together, Vivian slipped on a wet kitchen floor at her own house and couldn't get up. She called me, not them, because I was the one whose number she had memorized, not just saved. I drove her to the ER myself. It turned out to be a hairline hip fracture, not catastrophic, but enough for an overnight admission and a follow-up surgery consult. I texted my mother from the waiting room. She wrote back, "Oh no, keep me posted, we're mid-game, is she stable?" I told her she was stable. Nobody came that night. Nobody came the next morning either, until visiting hours were almost over. I found out later, secondhand, what the watch party actually looked like that night, a detail I only learned because Brooke mentioned it, months afterward, without realizing its weight. There were 14 people at my mother's house, a rented popcorn machine, a betting pool for the final score. My Aunt Pam had texted my mother sometime in the 3rd quarter, after I'd already called about Vivian's fall, something like, "Should we head over? Feels bad staying." My mother's reply, which Brooke also saw over her mother's shoulder, "Claire's got it handled. No point both of us leaving Frank to run the pool alone, lol." I don't say this to indict either of them further than the story already does. I say it because it's the kind of detail, small, specific, undramatic, that shows exactly how these decisions actually get made. Not in a single cruel moment, but in a text message about a betting pool, sent without any real malice at all. I sat with Vivian in that hospital room until almost 11, long after the watch party would have ended, long after anyone could have reasonably still claimed to be busy. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said something I didn't fully understand until much later. "I've been thinking I need to update some paperwork, Claire. Nothing urgent. Just thinking about it." I told her there was no rush, that she had plenty of time, and she smiled in a way that seemed sadder than the comment deserved. I didn't ask her what she meant. I wish, now, that I had. I didn't say anything to my mother or my aunt about the watch party that April. I told myself it was a one-time thing, a bad timing coincidence, not worth a confrontation. I want to be honest that I've since realized this was the 3rd time in 2 years something similar had happened, a cancelled visit for a work event, a rescheduled birthday dinner for a work trip, always with a reasonable-sounding excuse attached, always leaving me as the one who actually showed up. I didn't add it up in real time. I only saw the total much later, the way you only really see a staircase once you're standing at the top of it. There was a moment, about a month after the fall, when I almost said something. My mother and I were folding laundry at her house, and she mentioned, offhandedly, that she felt bad she hadn't made it to the hospital that night. I remember my heart speeding up, the sentence forming in my mouth, this is actually the third time, and then not saying it, because she looked genuinely regretful in that moment, and some part of me decided the regret was enough, that pointing out the pattern would only make her defensive instead of reflective. I folded a towel instead. I think about that folded towel more than I'd like to admit, because it was the exact moment I could have shortened everything that came after, and I chose the quieter, smaller path instead, the one that protected her feelings at the cost of my own clarity. In September, Vivian went in for a routine cardiology follow-up and came out with news none of us expected, a valve issue that had been quietly worsening for years, now serious enough that her cardiologist, Dr. Amara Solank, recommended surgery within the month rather than waiting for the usual scheduling window. Dr. Solank was direct about the risk without being alarmist. At 84, the surgery carried real risk, but so did waiting. Vivian called me first, before she called my mother, and asked if I'd come with her to the follow-up appointment where they'd set the date. I said yes without thinking twice. I don't think it occurred to me, at the time, that being the first call meant something. I told Priya about the diagnosis the same afternoon, standing at the returns cart sorting picture books back onto the shelf. She asked, first, how Vivian was doing emotionally, not just medically, which I appreciated more than I said out loud at the time. Then she asked, almost as an afterthought, is your mom going with you to appointments, or is it still just you? I told her it was still mostly just me, and she gave me a look I didn't fully register the significance of yet, not surprise, exactly, more like the quiet recognition of a pattern she'd already noticed from the outside, long before I'd said anything explicit enough to name it myself. The surgery got scheduled for October 14th, the same week as Brooke's wedding, which had been locked in for 8 months. I remember sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage after that appointment, doing the math in my head, already knowing what was going to happen before anyone said it out loud. My mother called a family meeting over speakerphone, herself, Pam, Frank, and me, with Vivian's blessing, since Vivian said she didn't want to be a topic of conversation she had to sit through. I want to be fair to what was said on that call, because I've replayed it many times. Nobody said, out loud, we're choosing the wedding over grandma. What they said was closer to this: the flights were non-refundable, Brooke had been planning this for 8 months, Vivian herself had said more than once that she didn't want to be a burden on anyone's plans, and the surgery, while serious, had a strong success rate according to Dr. Solank. My Aunt Pam said she'd never forgive herself if she thought she ruined Brooke's wedding. My mother said, we'll be back within days. She'll have you there, and that's more than enough. I didn't argue. I want to be honest about that. I said okay, because saying anything else felt, in that moment, like asking to be the reason Brooke's wedding fell apart, and I didn't know how to carry that weight in a single phone call. There's a moment from that speakerphone call I've never told anyone about, not even Daniel. After my mother said she'll have you there, and that's more than enough, there was a pause on the line, maybe 3 seconds, where I could have said something, could have said that I didn't actually know if I could do 6 hours of surgery and however many days of recovery entirely alone, could have asked someone to change one flight, just one, so I wouldn't be the only chair in that waiting room. I didn't say any of it. I said, okay, that makes sense, and the call moved on to logistics about who would water Vivian's plants. I've thought about that 3-second silence more than almost anything else in this whole story. It was the last real chance any of us had to do this differently, and I let it close without reaching for it. You'll keep us posted, right? Every few hours if you can. We looked into changing flights, it's just really not doable at this point. She said herself she didn't want us to cancel, so I don't think we're doing anything wrong here. That last text, from my mother, is the one I've thought about the most. I didn't respond to it. I didn't know, then, what to say to a sentence that was technically true and still somehow completely missed the point. My boyfriend, Daniel, has been with me for 4 years, long enough to have sat through more than one version of this exact family dynamic. The night before the surgery, I told him the whole plan, the wedding, the flights, that she said she didn't want to be a burden line, and he was quiet for a moment before he said, Claire, she's having open-heart surgery. That's not a scheduling conflict, that's a scheduling conflict pretending to be one. I told him it wasn't that simple, that Brooke had been planning this forever, that it wasn't fair to blow up someone else's wedding over timing nobody controlled. He didn't argue with me. He just said, "Okay. I'm taking the week off anyway. I'll be there when I can." I don't think I said thank you the way I should have. I was too tired, already, and it hadn't even started yet. I also had to sort out my own work schedule that week, which sounds like a minor logistical footnote but didn't feel minor at the time. I called my branch manager, Denise Farrow, no relation to my mother, an odd coincidence of shared names, and explained I'd need the week off for a family surgery. She was kind about it, told me Priya could cover story time, and asked, gently, if I had support at home for something this big. I told her yes, of course, family was flying in. I remember saying that sentence out loud, into the phone, already knowing it wasn't quite true, and feeling a strange, quiet shame about the gap between what I was saying and what was actually going to happen. I drove Vivian to the hospital myself at 5:40 in the morning on October 14th. She held my hand in the car the whole way, not saying much, and at one point she said, "You don't have to stay for all of it, you know. You have your own life." I told her I wasn't going anywhere. She squeezed my hand and didn't argue, which from Vivian, was its own kind of answer. Part 13b, the parking garage, again. I want to mention one more small detail from that morning, because it stayed with me in a way I didn't expect. I parked in the same hospital garage where I'd sat and done the math back in September, and I noticed, walking Vivian toward the entrance in a wheelchair the valet insisted on, that I recognized the parking spot almost exactly, the same level, nearly the same numbered stall. It felt like an odd, small full circle, standing in almost the same physical spot where I'd first understood I was going to be doing this alone, now actually doing it. I didn't mention it to Vivian. I just held the wheelchair steady over a bump in the pavement and kept walking. The pre-op waiting felt endless in the specific way hospital time always does. A nurse named Renata Cole, kind and efficient, walked me through what to expect, told me the surgery would run somewhere between 5 and 7 hours, and asked, almost as an afterthought, who else would be joining me. I told her it would just be me for now, that family was traveling and would be in as soon as they could. She nodded without judgment, the way people do when they've seen every version of a family before and have learned not to comment on any of them. The surgery took 6 hours and 40 minutes. I sat in the same waiting room chair for almost all of it, leaving twice, once for the bathroom, once because Renata insisted I eat something from the cafeteria, a turkey sandwich I don't remember tasting. I texted the family group chat updates every hour, exactly as promised, still in surgery, no news yet, that's normal. My mother responded twice, both times a single word, okay, sent, I'd learn later, from the middle of the wedding rehearsal dinner. I remember, in a strange, sideways way, some of the other people who cycled through that waiting room during those 6 hours and 40 minutes, a young couple waiting on news about the husband's father, an entire extended family of maybe 9 people camped out with blankets and a cooler for someone's grandmother, laughing quietly together between updates. I didn't resent them. I want to be clear about that. But I noticed them, the way you notice weather, the way you notice anything that makes your own situation more visible by comparison. Renata came by twice just to check on me specifically, not with updates, there weren't any yet, but just to ask if I wanted a coffee, if I was doing okay sitting there by myself. I said I was fine both times. I don't think either of us fully believed it. Dr. Solank came out just after 3 p.m., still in scrubs, and told me the surgery had gone well, the valve had been successfully repaired, Vivian was in recovery, the next 48 hours would be the critical window for monitoring, but so far everything looked as good as they could have hoped. I called my mother immediately. She picked up on the second ring, background noise of laughter and clinking glasses behind her, and said, "Oh, thank God. Okay. Keep us posted, we're just sitting down for dinner." I said okay. I hung up and sat back down in the same chair and let myself cry for the first time all day, quietly, in a waiting room full of strangers who were kind enough not to look at me directly. The lowest point came 2 nights later, in the ICU, when Vivian woke up disoriented, still groggy from sedation, and asked, in a small voice I'd never heard from her before, "Where's your mother?" I told her they were still at the wedding, that they'd be back soon, and she was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Right. The wedding." She didn't sound angry. She sounded like she was simply confirming something she'd already, somewhere underneath the sedation, already known was true. I held her hand until she fell back asleep, and I remember thinking that this was the exact opposite of comfort, being the only person in the room, watching someone you love quietly absorb being forgotten, and having no way to make it not true. Daniel came by that same evening, after his workday, and found me in the ICU family lounge instead of at the bedside, since visiting hours had a strict two-person limit and Renata had gently suggested I take a break. He didn't say much at first. He just sat next to me on the small vinyl couch and let me lean into his shoulder for a long time without asking me to narrate any of it. Eventually he said, "You don't have to hold this together perfectly, you know. Nobody's grading you on it." I told him I didn't know how to do it any other way, and he said, quietly, "I know. That's kind of the problem, isn't it?" He didn't mean it unkindly. I think it was the first time anyone had said out loud that my steadiness, the thing everyone in my family relied on without ever quite thanking me for it, might also be costing me something. There was another patient in the shared recovery room during Vivian's second night, an older woman named Ruth Okonkwo whose entire family, 3 adult children, by my count, rotated through in shifts around the clock. I don't say this to shame anyone, I was glad for Ruth, glad she had that. But I noticed the nurse on duty glance between the 2 beds more than once, and I understood, without either of us saying anything, what she was seeing. I wasn't imagining the contrast. It was right there, visible, in the number of chairs pulled up to each bed. In the middle of all this, on the 3rd day, I got a single text from Brooke herself, sent from the wedding. "I feel so bad, I hope Grandma's doing okay, tell her I love her. Can't wait to see pics when we're back." I remember staring at it for a long time, unsure what response could possibly fit the gap between where she was and where I was. I finally wrote back, "She's doing okay, resting. Have fun." I meant the second half more than I expected to. I didn't want Brooke's wedding to be ruined by guilt she hadn't caused directly. I just wished, quietly, that the family's arithmetic had weighed things differently before it ever reached a point where that gap needed managing at all. My family flew back 4 days after the surgery, tan and tired from the wedding, arriving at the hospital in the late afternoon with a gift bag of seashell soaps for Vivian that felt, in that room, almost absurd. My mother hugged Vivian carefully, avoiding the 4-line, and said, "You look wonderful, Mom, I'm so relieved." My Aunt Pam cried real tears at the bedside, which I believe were genuine, and said, "I hated being away for this, I really did." Nobody, in that first visit, mentioned the 4 days. I didn't bring it up either. I was too exhausted to have the conversation I'd been rehearsing in my head for 4 days straight. I finally raised it 2 days later, in the hospital cafeteria, just my mother and me. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that it had been hard being the only one there, that I didn't think anyone understood what those 4 days had actually looked like from the inside. My mother's response came quickly, almost rehearsed, "You've done this before, made yourself the martyr in situations that didn't need one. We talked about it as a family, Claire. It wasn't a decision made lightly." I told her it hadn't felt like a decision that included me, only one that had been explained to me afterward. She said, "We didn't think it would actually be that hard on you. You've always been so capable, we didn't think you needed us there the way." She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, but I understood what she meant. The way Vivian did. As if my capability had somehow made the absence acceptable, rather than simply making it survivable. I didn't argue further. I said I needed to get back upstairs, and I did, and we didn't talk about it again for weeks. I should mention my Uncle Frank here too, briefly, because he occupies a strange middle position in this story. Frank isn't a blood relative of Vivian's, and I think that gave him a kind of outsider's clarity the rest of the family lacked. He pulled me aside quietly at the hospital, on that first visit back, while Pam and my mother were fussing over Vivian's pillows, and said, "For what it's worth, I told Pam we should send at least one of us back early." I got outvoted. It wasn't an apology, exactly, and it didn't change anything that had already happened. But it was the first acknowledgement from anyone in the traveling group that the decision hadn't been unanimous, that there had been a version of that week where someone came home sooner, and it simply hadn't won. My coworker Priya Anand runs story time on the days I don't, and she's the kind of friend who listens for a long time before she says anything at all. I called her from the hospital parking garage after that cafeteria conversation, and after I finished explaining everything, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Claire, you drove her to a 6-hour heart surgery alone and sat in a waiting room by yourself for 4 days. That's not you being capable. That's you being abandoned with good manners." I laughed, a little, at how exactly she'd named it, and then I cried again, in the parking garage, for the second time that week. She didn't tell me what to do about it. She just said, "You're allowed to be furious about this. You don't have to perform gratitude that they came back tan." I need to introduce someone here who had nothing to do with the wedding, nothing to do with the 4 days, and everything to do with what happened next. Margaret Whitcomb has been an elder law attorney for 31 years, and she drafted Vivian's original will back in the 1990s, not long after my grandfather Walter died. She and Vivian had stayed in touch loosely over the decades, a Christmas card, an occasional lunch, the kind of relationship that outlasts most professional ones because it was never purely professional to begin with. Margaret had no idea what had happened at the wedding, no idea about the 4 days, no idea about the watch party 6 months earlier. She only knew what Vivian herself had told her, weeks before any of this, that she wanted to update her estate plan, and that given the upcoming surgery, she'd rather not wait until afterward to do it. Margaret's connection to my family went back further than just the will. She'd actually known my grandfather Walter first, as a customer of his hardware store in the early 90s, before she'd ever met Vivian. She told me, much later, that Walter had once spent 45 minutes helping her figure out the right hardware for a bookshelf she was building, refusing to let her overpay for parts she didn't need. "That's who I picture every time I think about this family," she told me. "A man who wouldn't let a stranger spend $1 more than necessary." I don't think Vivian's decision here is so different from that, honestly. She wasn't trying to punish anyone. She was just trying to make sure something honest happened with what she had left. It turned out, and I only learned this afterward, that the night of the fall in April, after I'd gone home and Vivian was alone in her hospital room with nothing but the sound of the hallway outside, she had asked a nurse for a phone book, found Margaret's office number, and left a voicemail the next morning asking to schedule an appointment. Margaret called her back within the week. Vivian didn't tell any of us. Not me, not my mother, not anyone. She simply started, quietly, revising a document that had sat untouched for almost 15 years. Margaret's firm has a standard practice for elderly clients undergoing major surgery with pending and signed document revisions. Get the documents formally executed and witnessed before the procedure whenever possible, specifically to avoid the legal complications that arise if a client becomes incapacitated with a will still in draft form. When Vivian mentioned, at a routine planning meeting in early September, that she had a valve surgery coming up in October, Margaret's office flagged the file and scheduled an in-hospital signing for the same week as the surgery, as they routinely did for any client in a similar position. It had nothing to do with the wedding. It had nothing to do with me. It was simply how Margaret's office handled exactly this kind of timing, for every client who found themselves in it. Margaret walked into the ICU waiting room on the second day, while I was still alone, carrying a leather folio and asking a nurse where she might find Vivian Ashcroft's room. I introduced myself, and she recognized my name immediately. "You're the granddaughter she talks about," she said, which was the first time all week anyone had said something to me that felt like it saw me clearly. She explained, simply, that she had a scheduled document signing with Vivian, something they'd set up weeks earlier, and asked if now was a reasonable time or if she should come back. I told her Vivian was still groggy from the surgery but should be more alert by evening. Margaret said she'd wait, and she did. She sat in the chair beside mine for almost 2 hours, and we talked, quietly, about nothing important, the way strangers do when they're both waiting for the same thing. When Vivian was finally alert enough that evening, Margaret went in briefly, with a hospital notary they'd arranged in advance, and came back out about 40 minutes later. She didn't tell me what was in the documents. She was careful, professional, and clear about that boundary, but she did say one thing to me on her way out that I've held on to since. Your grandmother is a very clear-eyed woman, Claire. She knew exactly what she wanted before I ever walked into that room. I just made sure it was properly witnessed. It wasn't a reveal, not yet. It was just a lawyer doing her job, on an ordinary Tuesday, completely unaware of the 4 empty chairs that had sat around that hospital bed the week before. I want to go back to those 2 hours Margaret and I spent waiting together before Vivian was alert enough for the signing, because I think about that conversation more than almost any other in this story. We didn't talk about wills or family dynamics at all, not directly. She asked about my job at the library, told me about a case she'd handled years ago involving a client's estranged grandson, careful never to name names or violate anyone's privacy. At one point she said, almost in passing, you know, in 31 years of doing this work, I've noticed something. The families who show up consistently rarely think of themselves as doing anything special. It's the families who show up occasionally who tend to describe themselves as devoted. I didn't know, in that moment, that she was about to become part of the reason my own family would eventually have to reckon with exactly that distinction. My mother happened to be in the hallway when Margaret was leaving, and asked me, once she was gone, who that had been. I told her, honestly, that it was Vivian's attorney, there for some paperwork. My mother's face did something I still think about, a flicker of confusion, quickly smoothed over. Paperwork? What kind of paperwork? I told her I genuinely didn't know, which was true. She didn't push further in the moment. But I noticed, over the next several days, that she'd started asking Vivian small, careful questions about getting her affairs in order, questions that had never seemed to interest her before. That same week, my mother asked me directly, in the hospital hallway, do you know something I don't? I told her, honestly, that I didn't know what was in the paperwork, which was true. What I didn't say, what I wasn't ready to say yet, was that I had a growing, uneasy feeling that Vivian had been quietly taking stock of something for months, maybe longer, and that none of us had thought to ask her directly what she'd been noticing. I let my mother's question hang there, unanswered in any real way, and went back into Vivian's room without elaborating further. Vivian recovered steadily over the following 2 weeks, moved to a rehab facility for 10 days, and was cleared to go home in early November. My mother and aunt were far more present during this stretch, daily visits, meal deliveries, the kind of attentiveness that made me wonder, uncharitably, whether guilt was a more reliable motivator in my family than love on its own. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because it's true, and because I've had to make peace with the fact that it's true about a lot of families, mine included. The 10 days at the rehab facility had their own quiet rhythm that I haven't described yet. I visited most evenings after work, watched Vivian relearn how to climb a short flight of practice stairs with a physical therapist named Josh who treated her with a gentle, unhurried patience I recognized because it mirrored my own with the kids at story time. My mother came twice during those 10 days, my aunt once. I noted it without saying anything, the way I'd apparently trained myself to note everything by then, filing it away rather than raising it, still not sure what I was going to do with any of the tally I was quietly keeping. The month after Vivian came home was quiet in a way that felt almost suspicious after everything that had happened. Nobody mentioned Margaret's visit again. I didn't bring it up either, mostly because I genuinely didn't know what it meant and didn't want to speculate. I went back to my regular Wednesday visits with Vivian, and neither of us talked about the wedding, or the 4 days, or the lawyer. We played gin rummy. She beat me twice out of 3 games, same as always, and for a while it felt like the ordinary rhythm of our relationship had simply resumed, undisturbed. I said the quiet month felt like our ordinary rhythm resuming, and mostly it did, but there was one Wednesday in late November where Vivian paused mid-game, card still in her hand, and said, out of nowhere, "You never once made me feel like a burden, Claire." Not once, in all of this. I didn't know what to say, so I made a joke about her cheating at gin rummy instead, and she let me deflect, the way she always let me deflect from anything too tender. But I noticed she won that hand without really trying, and I wondered, afterward, whether she'd said it right then because some part of her had already decided what she was going to do next, and wanted me to hear it plainly, once, before the paperwork made it official. In early December, Vivian handed me an envelope during one of our Wednesday visits, unprompted, and asked me to read it later, at home, alone. I did. It was 2 handwritten pages, and I'm not going to repeat all of it here, but the heart of it was this: she wrote that the night of her fall in April, alone in that hospital room, she had done something she hadn't done in years, which was take a clear, honest look at exactly who showed up for her and who didn't. She wrote that it wasn't about anger. It was about accuracy. She wrote that she'd updated her will that same week, not out of spite, but because she wanted the people who'd loved her steadily, in the unglamorous months as much as the holidays, to know that she'd seen it, even when she never said so out loud. I read Vivian's letter 3 times that first night, and I want to share one more piece of it, because I think it explains something about her that the will alone couldn't. She wrote that she didn't blame my mother or my aunt for being who they were, that she understood, better than they probably realized, exactly where their instincts to keep busy and stay away from hard things had come from, since she'd watched it form in them as children. But she wrote that understanding where a pattern comes from isn't the same as being obligated to reward it forever, and that she'd decided, at 84, she was allowed to make one decision that was simply, plainly true to her own experience, without needing anyone else's permission to make it. Vivian called a family meeting herself, in mid-December, at her own kitchen table, with Margaret present to explain the documents formally. I want to describe this carefully, because I don't think of it as a triumphant moment, even though I understand why it might sound like one. Margaret explained, plainly and without editorializing, that Vivian's updated will named me as executor, and left the house on Chestnut Avenue, the one asset with real sentimental and financial weight in the estate, to me outright, with the remainder of her modest savings divided evenly among her children and grandchildren, as it always had been. It wasn't a punishment dressed up as a legal document. It was, simply, an accurate reflection of who Vivian had actually experienced as present in her life over the last several years. My mother went very still when Margaret finished explaining, and then said, quietly, "I don't understand. We're her children." Margaret, gently, said that the will wasn't a statement about who was loved, only about a specific decision Vivian had made about a specific asset, and that Vivian was welcome to explain her own reasoning if she chose to. My mother turned to Vivian directly. "Mom, is this about the wedding?" Vivian was quiet for a moment before she answered. "It's about April, mostly. And a few other times before that, if I'm being honest. The wedding was just the clearest example." My mother opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if she'd started to formulate a defense and then realized, mid-breath, that she didn't actually have one that would hold up in that particular room. She didn't ask Vivian to explain further. She just sat there, and I watched something shift across her face, not anger, exactly, but a kind of dawning recognition, as if she were quickly running the same math I'd run in that parking garage months earlier, and arriving, belatedly, at the same total. My Aunt Pam's reaction was different, immediate, defensive, directed at me rather than at Vivian. "Did you put her up to this?" she asked, and I told her, honestly, that I hadn't known any of it existed until that afternoon, same as her. Margaret confirmed, factually, that the documents had been initiated by Vivian alone, in April, months before the wedding was even a factor in anyone's calendar. Pam didn't apologize in that meeting. She left early, citing a headache, and it was 3 weeks before she called me again. Frank was the only one in that kitchen who didn't seem surprised by any of it. When the meeting broke up, he caught me by the door on his way out and said, quietly, "I told Pam this might happen. Not the specifics, obviously. But I told her, you can't keep treating showing up as optional and expect nobody to notice eventually." I asked him why he hadn't said that more forcefully back in October, before any of it happened. He was honest with me. "Because it's not my mother," he said. "It's not really my place to push that hard on someone else's family. I regret that now, for what it's worth." It wasn't absolution, exactly, but it was the most self-aware thing anyone in the traveling group said to me that entire week. My cousin Brooke, whose wedding had been the reason for all of it, Wasn't at that meeting. She and Tyler were still settling into married life 2 states away, but she called me that same week, having heard about it secondhand from her mother. She was the one family member who said, without hesitation, "I've felt sick about this since the wedding, Claire." I should have said something to my parents at the time, and I didn't, because I didn't want to make my own wedding about something else. "I'm sorry." It was the only unambiguous apology I received from anyone in my family that entire winter, and it came from the person who had, technically, benefited most from the original decision. Brooke and I talked for almost an hour that week, longer than we'd talked one-on-one in years. She told me she'd actually asked her mother, from the beach house, whether they should change anyone's flight, and had been told, gently but firmly, that it wasn't necessary, that Claire had it handled. I believed her, Brooke said. I wanted to believe her, probably, because it meant I didn't have to think about it during my own wedding. I'm not proud of that. I told her I didn't hold it against her, and I meant it. She'd been 26 years old on the biggest week of her own life, trusting the adults around her to have made a reasonable call. The adults, I pointed out, were the ones who should have known better. Things didn't transform overnight, and I want to be honest about that instead of pretending they did. My mother started calling Vivian twice a week instead of once, and started coming to some of the Wednesday visits herself, awkwardly at first, then less so. My Aunt Pam took almost 2 months before she visited Vivian again, and when she finally did, she brought a photo album from Brooke's wedding, which felt like her particular way of trying to close a loop she couldn't quite name out loud. Nobody sat me down and delivered a clean, cinematic apology. What I got instead was a slow accumulation of small, specific efforts, a phone call here, a visit there, that added up, gradually, to something that looked less like guilt and more like genuine change. When Pam finally called me again, 3 weeks after the meeting, she didn't apologize directly. What she said instead was, "I'd been thinking about April a lot. I didn't realize you'd never really let it go." I told her I hadn't been holding on to it as a grudge, exactly, just as information I hadn't known what to do with. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "I think I convinced myself that because you never made a big deal about it, it wasn't a big deal. That's on me, not on you." It wasn't a full accounting of everything that had happened, but it was the first time she'd taken any ownership at all, and I let myself accept it as a real, if incomplete, start. My mother's shift was slower and quieter than Pam's, which somehow felt more genuine for being less dramatic. She didn't have a single big conversation with me about it. Instead, over the following months, I noticed small, specific changes. She started texting Vivian just to check in on ordinary Tuesdays, not only Sundays. She asked me, once, unprompted, what Vivian's cardiologist had actually said about her long-term prognosis, a level of detail she'd never asked for before. I didn't point out the change when I noticed it. I just let it accumulate, the same way the absence had once accumulated, except this time in the other direction. I asked Vivian directly, a few weeks after the meeting, whether she'd meant the will as a message to the rest of the family. She thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Not exactly a message," she said. "More like an honest accounting." I didn't want to spend my last years pretending I hadn't noticed what I'd noticed. The house was the one thing I had that actually meant something, and I wanted it to go to the person who actually showed up for the house's owner, not just the house. I told her I hadn't done any of it expecting anything in return. She said, "I know. That's exactly why. It's been just over a year now since the surgery. Vivian's heart has held up well. Dr. Solank calls her recovery better than most patients half her age, which Vivian repeats at every opportunity with obvious pride. My mother has kept up the twice-weekly calls, and joined me for a Wednesday visit almost once a month now, something that would have been unthinkable the year before. My Aunt Pam and I aren't as close as my mother and I have become, but she sends Vivian a card every few weeks now, small and unprompted, which I've come to understand as her particular language for trying. Brooke had her first child this spring, and when she brought the baby to meet Vivian, she made a point of staying the entire afternoon, no flight to catch, nowhere else to be. I don't think that was a coincidence. I've thought a great deal, since that December afternoon, about the difference between love that shows up in big, photographable moments and love that shows up in 6 hours and 40 minutes of waiting room silence nobody else witnesses. I think my family loves Vivian, genuinely. I also think love without consistency can quietly become a kind of performance, even when nobody intends it that way, present for the parts that make a good story later, absent for the parts that are just hard. I didn't do what I did to be rewarded for it. I did it because I couldn't imagine doing anything else. The will wasn't proof that I'd been right to show up. It was just proof that someone had finally noticed. If you're the one who always shows up, the emergency contact who actually answers, the name at the top of the list because you're the one who's reliable, not because anyone asked if you wanted the job, I'd tell you this: showing up isn't supposed to be silent. Say the hard sentence out loud, the one about how it felt to be the only chair in the waiting room, even if you're afraid it'll sound like keeping score. It isn't keeping score. It's just telling the truth about your own life, and the people who love you well will eventually be able to hear it, even if it takes them longer than you'd like. I'd also say this, because it took me longer to understand than almost anything else: you don't need permission to notice a pattern, and you don't need to wait until it costs you something as large as a hospital hallway to name it. I had the information after the watch party in April. I had it again after the birthday dinner before that. I chose, both times, to fold the towel instead of saying the sentence, because the sentence felt like it might cost me the relationship, when really, the silence was what had already started costing me the relationship, slowly, in ways I only recognized once I finally stopped protecting everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own. And if you're the parent, the sibling, the family member who has, without meaning to, let someone else absorb the hard, unglamorous parts of caregiving while you show up for the parts that photograph well, I'd ask you to consider a specific, uncomfortable exercise. Count the chairs. Count who was actually in the room on the ordinary Tuesdays, not just the milestones. It's an easy thing to avoid counting, because the answer is often quieter and less flattering than we'd like. But the people doing the counting rarely stop, even when we hope they will, and it's kinder to everyone to reckon with the total honestly before someone else has to hand it to you in a manila folder. I don't think of my mother or my aunt as villains, even now. I think of them as people who got used to my steadiness the way you get used to anything reliable, by stopping noticing it. I don't think Vivian's will was revenge, exactly, though I understand why it might look that way from the outside. I think it was the truest thing she had left to give me, an old woman's honest accounting of who had actually been in the room, offered not to punish anyone else but simply to finally tell the truth out loud, in the one language, a legal document, witnessed and notarized, that nobody in this family could argue their way around. I still play gin rummy with her every Wednesday. She still beats me most of the time, and I've stopped minding, if I ever really did. The house on Chestnut Avenue will be mine someday, but that was never really the part that mattered, not to me and, I've come to believe, not really to her either. What mattered was smaller than a house and larger than money. It was a hospital hallway, a manila folder, an old woman deciding at 84 that she still had the right to say, plainly, who had actually shown up. What mattered was that somebody, finally, wrote it down. If you've ever been the one who quietly did the hard part while everyone else found a reason not to, I'd love to hear how it happened, and what changed afterward. Let me know in the comments. And if this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one coming every week.